He never performed for applause. He performed for memory. And that morning, memory was waiting in the lobby. Daniel Reeves had not celebrated Valentine's Day since the winter his wife died. For him, February no longer carried roses or reservations, it carried hospital corridors, unfinished sentences, and a violin case he only opened once a year. He worked nights as a security guard inside Ellington Tower, a glass and steel monument to power rising above the Manhattan skyline. By day, he was a single father raising a 5-year-old daughter who still believed love could be heard if someone played it softly enough. The violin had once belonged to Emily. During her final months, when treatment schedules replaced vacations and whispered prayers replaced future plans, music had become the only language that did not exhaust her. With the help of a volunteer mentor at the oncology center, a quiet businessman who donated time without cameras, she composed a melody meant for Valentine's Day. It was simple, tender, and incomplete in a way that felt honest. Daniel had helped arrange the notes. They had promised to play it every year. But Emily never made it to the 2nd February. That morning, Sophie had insisted he bring the violin to work. She had placed it gently in his hands before school, telling him her mother would not want the song to stay silent. Daniel had smiled at the innocence of it, yet something inside him yielded. During his break, beneath the vast chandelier of the Ellington Tower lobby, surrounded by marble floors that reflected wealth and ambition, he lifted the instrument to his shoulder and began to play. The first notes were hesitant, as though asking permission to exist in a place built for transactions rather than tenderness. But the melody soon found its rhythm. It rose through the open atrium, carrying warmth into a space unaccustomed to vulnerability. Employees slowed their steps. Conversations softened. The sound traveled upward like something searching. On the 32nd floor, inside a private executive office lined with glass and silence, Margaret Ellington paused mid-stride. The melody reached her before the memory did. Her breath caught before she understood why. Because she had heard that arrangement before, not in a hospital room, but in her own kitchen, years earlier, when her husband Thomas had been humming into the quiet of a winter evening. And the final phrase, the descending minor chord, struck her like recognition carved in sound. Margaret did not hesitate. She left her office and took the elevator down without informing anyone. As the doors opened into the lobby, the music met her fully. Daniel's eyes were closed as he played. He did not see the CEO of the building standing among reception staff and assistants. He did not know that the woman listening had buried her husband in a private ceremony 3 years earlier, after a plane crash that ended not only a marriage but a future carefully built over decades. Margaret stood motionless. The melody did not simply resemble Thomas's composition. It was Thomas's composition. Her composure, perfected over years of boardrooms and shareholder scrutiny, fractured quietly as tears slipped down her face before she could stop them. Employees stared, stunned by the sight of a woman who had never allowed grief to surface publicly. Daniel lowered the violin when he sensed the stillness around him shift. And in that suspended moment, 2 separate love stories stood inside the same unfinished song. Neither of them yet understood how that was possible. But both felt it. Because only 2 people had ever known that melody before that morning. And one of them was supposed to be gone forever. What neither Daniel nor Margaret knew was that the song had been written in 2 different places, by 2 different grieving hearts, guided by the same invisible hand. For 3 years, she mastered silence. But grief recognizes its own language. Margaret Ellington had built an empire on composure. After her husband Thomas died in the winter plane crash that reshaped her life overnight, she did not collapse in public. She did not retreat from the boardroom. Instead, she stepped forward with a steadiness that unsettled even her closest advisors. Within months, she restructured divisions, expanded global partnerships, and stabilized Ellington Global in ways analysts later described as surgical. Investors praised her discipline. Employees admired her control. No one saw the cost of it. Grief, when denied voice, does not disappear. It settles into the body and waits. On the morning Daniel Reeves played that melody in the lobby, Margaret had been preparing for a Valentine's investor luncheon. Pink floral arrangements had been placed near the reception desk, curated more for brand optics than sentiment. Valentine's Day had become, for her, a date she navigated with strategic distraction. She scheduled meetings. She avoided quiet. But the moment the first notes drifted upward through the atrium, something inside her shifted. The melody was unmistakable, a delicate rise, followed by a gentle hesitation, then the descending minor chord Thomas used to repeat while stirring coffee late at night. He had once described it as unfinished on purpose, saying that love should always leave space for tomorrow. Margaret had listened absent-mindedly at the time, unaware she would one day cling to that unfinished phrase as proof that he had existed beyond headlines. Standing in the elevator descending toward the lobby, Margaret felt something she had suppressed for years, anticipation mixed with fear. It was irrational. Music travels. Coincidences happen. Yet her pulse quickened in a way she could not explain. When the elevator doors opened, the marble floor reflected the scene before her with stark clarity. A uniformed security guard stood beneath the chandelier, violin resting against his shoulder, eyes closed as if playing for someone who was no longer visible. A small cluster of employees had gathered quietly around him. The atmosphere felt fragile, suspended between corporate routine and something more intimate. Margaret remained near the back at first, listening. Each phrase confirmed what her memory already knew. This was not a similar composition. It was structurally identical, same transitions, same imperfect pause before the final note. She remembered Thomas sitting at their kitchen table with sheet music scattered around him, adjusting tempo while describing a woman at the hospital who insisted on adding warmth to the arrangement. He had never elaborated. He had simply said he was helping someone finish something meaningful. Margaret had never asked further questions. As the final note lingered and dissolved into silence, she felt the composure she had cultivated over 3 disciplined years fracture without warning. Tears surfaced before she could intercept them. For a woman who had navigated hostile acquisitions and shareholder revolts without visible emotion, the vulnerability startled even herself. The lobby noticed. But Margaret did not care. The security guard lowered the violin slowly, sensing the shift in atmosphere. His face carried exhaustion softened by tenderness. There was no ambition in his posture. No performance ego. Only quiet remembrance. Margaret stepped forward. She did not accuse. She did not demand explanation. She simply stood close enough to see that his hands trembled slightly as he rested the bow against his side. In that moment, she realized something that unsettled her more than the melody itself. This man was not exploiting a song. He was grieving through it. Which meant the melody had belonged to him too. Margaret's mind moved quickly now, piecing together fragments of Thomas's final year. His weekly volunteer visits to a private oncology center. The late-night revisions to a melody he claimed was not entirely his own. The way he had described collaboration rather than authorship. She had dismissed those details as peripheral at the time. Now they felt essential. The possibility unfolded gradually. Thomas had not written that melody alone. He had co-written it with someone whose life intersected his only briefly, someone who may have lost more than she did. Margaret steadied herself, not out of pride but necessity. She had built her company by confronting truth directly. She would confront this one the same way. As the lobby resumed its muted rhythm, she instructed her assistant to clear the afternoon schedule. The investor luncheon could wait. Earnings projections could wait. There was something more urgent beneath the chandelier, a shared thread of memory demanding clarity. Because if that melody truly originated from Thomas's final months, then the man holding the violin was connected to a chapter of her husband's life she had never fully known. And if that chapter involved another family, another loss, then the story of Thomas Ellington's final year was not complete. Margaret turned toward the security desk once more, studying Daniel Reeves with new attention. For the first time since the accident, she felt something stronger than sorrow. She felt proximity. And she knew that before the day ended, she would ask the question that had been waiting inside her since the first note reached her office. How could a stranger be carrying her husband's last melody? What she was about to discover would not threaten Thomas's memory. It would expand it. Some songs are written once. This one had lived in 2 grieving homes. Margaret did not approach Daniel immediately. Instead, she observed him from a measured distance, the way she had learned to evaluate mergers and risks, patiently, attentively, without premature assumption. He returned the violin to its case with care that felt almost reverent, as though placing something fragile back into silence. There was no theatricality in his movements. No awareness that the most powerful woman in the building was studying him not as an employee, but as a missing piece of a memory she had carried alone. She requested a private meeting in one of the smaller conference rooms overlooking the river. Not as CEO summoning staff, but as a widow seeking truth. Daniel entered the room with quiet humility, unaware that his morning ritual had reopened a chapter sealed by tragedy. His uniform remained crisp, his posture respectful, yet there was something guarded in his expression now. He had sensed the weight in the lobby. He had seen the woman whose composure broke at the final note. Margaret spoke carefully, recounting what she knew without accusation. She described Thomas's volunteer work at the oncology center during his final year, how he had insisted on spending Wednesday evenings there without press coverage. She explained how he returned home once speaking about a melody that was not entirely his, something he had helped shape but refused to claim ownership of. Daniel listened in stillness, the air between them thick with recognition. It became clear, slowly and without dramatic revelation, that Emily Reeves, Daniel's late wife, had been one of the patients Thomas mentored. During her treatment, music therapy had offered her a form of authorship over a body she felt was betraying her. Thomas had provided structure. Emily had provided heart. Daniel had provided harmony. The melody that echoed through Ellington Tower had been born in a hospital room filled with antiseptic light and quiet courage. Neither Thomas nor Emily had framed it as extraordinary. It had simply been a way to endure. Margaret absorbed this with a mixture of ache and astonishment. She had believed she knew every meaningful detail of her husband's final year. She had catalogued his meetings, his philanthropic donations, his final recorded speeches. But this collaboration, had existed outside her knowledge. Not as betrayal. Not as secrecy. But as a kindness he considered too ordinary to mention. Daniel, in turn, realized something equally profound. The anonymous mentor who had guided Emily through her composition was not simply a volunteer. He had been a man carrying his own fears about mortality, disguising vulnerability beneath quiet service. Thomas had never introduced himself by title. He had introduced himself by listening. The melody had been co-authored by 2 people confronting endings, neither aware that their shared creation would outlive them both. Margaret felt something shift inside her. For years, she had carried Thomas's death as solitary weight, believing widowhood was an isolating inheritance. Now she understood that part of his final legacy had been shared with another family, another bedside, another grieving spouse who had also stood helpless against inevitability. This realization did not diminish her marriage. It deepened it. Outside the conference room windows, the Hudson reflected winter light in muted silver. The city continued its rhythm, unaware that inside one glass enclosure, 2 stories of loss were aligning without conflict. Daniel explained that he played the melody only once a year, on Valentine's Day, because it had been Emily's request. Margaret admitted that Thomas had once said the same date carried significance for him. Neither had known the other upheld the ritual. What startled them both was the precision of the arrangement, the pauses, the modulation, the unresolved cadence at the end. Those details had not been written independently. They had been crafted together in a room neither Margaret nor Daniel had ever shared. Which meant something extraordinary had occurred in that hospital, two strangers had created a piece of music strong enough to survive both of them. Margaret requested access to the original sheet music Thomas had archived. Daniel offered to retrieve the handwritten draft Emily had left behind. As evidence accumulated, alignment replaced doubt. The compositions matched note for note, including an intentional imperfection Thomas once described as leaving space for tomorrow. Tomorrow had never arrived for either composer. But the melody had. And now it stood between two surviving partners who had believed grief belonged exclusively to them. Margaret returned to her office that afternoon carrying something unfamiliar, not sorrow, not even closure, but expansion. Thomas's final chapter was no longer limited to a crash report and a memorial speech. It included a hospital room filled with quiet collaboration and a man who had loved his wife enough to play her song every year. Daniel left Ellington Tower that evening holding his violin case differently. The music inside it no longer felt like a private relic. It felt connected to a wider story, one that suggested Emily had not faced her final months alone. Neither of them yet understood what this connection would demand. But both sensed that the melody had not resurfaced by accident. It had waited. And what lay hidden inside the violin case, something Daniel had overlooked for years, was about to reveal that Thomas Ellington had anticipated this moment long before either of them realized it. Some men leave fortunes. Others leave instructions. That night, long after Ellington Tower emptied and the city softened into distant light, Daniel sat alone at his small kitchen table with the violin case resting in front of him. Sophie was asleep down the hall, her breathing steady and unburdened by the revelations that had shifted the day. The apartment carried the quiet humility of a life rebuilt carefully after loss: mismatched chairs, framed photographs, a calendar marked with school reminders. Nothing in the room suggested legacy. And yet, legacy lay folded inside velvet. Daniel had opened the case thousands of times over the years. He knew every scratch in the wood, every faint imperfection along the bow's handle. But that evening, his hands moved more slowly, guided by something he could not name. The conversation with Margaret had unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Emily had never mentioned Thomas Ellington by name. She had only described him as the mentor, as if identity were secondary to kindness. When Daniel lifted the violin from its cradle, his fingers brushed against something rigid beneath the lining. He paused. There, tucked carefully under the velvet fold where the instrument rested, was a sealed envelope he had never noticed before. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, as though it had been waiting patiently for discovery rather than hidden in urgency. His name was not written on it. Nor was Emily's. Instead, the envelope bore a single sentence in handwriting Daniel did not recognize. "If the music ever returns, let it finish what we started." The ink had faded but remained deliberate. Daniel sat down slowly, heart steady but heavy, and opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter signed by Thomas Ellington. The words were not dramatic. They were not poetic. They were restrained in the way only men accustomed to responsibility write when facing mortality. Thomas described meeting a woman in the oncology wing who insisted on composing something beautiful despite a prognosis that offered little time. He described being moved by her refusal to let illness define her final contribution. He admitted that he had grown attached to the melody not because it was perfect, but because it was unfinished. "If you're reading this," the letter continued, "it means she didn't outlive the song. And perhaps neither did I. But music is stubborn. It refuses to end where we do." Daniel's vision blurred slightly, not from shock but recognition. Thomas had known his own condition was worsening. He had known the private medical diagnosis he never shared publicly would eventually silence him too. And yet, instead of focusing on what he would lose, he had focused on what could remain. The final paragraph shifted something deeper. "If the melody survives us, help it belong somewhere larger than grief. It was never meant to be kept in one house." Daniel folded the letter carefully, his breathing slower now. For years, he had believed the melody belonged to him and Emily alone, a private ritual between a husband and wife interrupted too soon. Now he understood it had always been collaborative in more ways than he realized. Thomas had not merely assisted in its arrangement. He had anticipated its endurance. Across the city, Margaret sat inside her study holding a scanned copy of the same letter. She had found the digital version in Thomas's archived files earlier that evening, labeled simply, Valentine Project, Contingency. She had assumed it referred to a corporate initiative. It did not. Reading the letter in the stillness of her penthouse, Margaret felt something she had denied herself for years: relief. Thomas had not left her only with silence and a crash report. He had left continuity. He had left evidence that even in his final months, he chose connection over withdrawal. She rose and walked toward the window overlooking Manhattan, the skyline illuminated in quiet brilliance. Her life had been structured around scale, acquisitions, valuations, expansion metrics. But this letter reduced everything to something more intimate. A hospital room. A shared melody. Two families unaware they were linked by the same unfinished chord. The next morning, Margaret requested the original hospital records from the oncology center. Not for legal clarity, not for liability review, but for understanding. She learned that Thomas had donated anonymously to fund creative therapy programs in multiple wings of the hospital. He had insisted his name not appear on plaques. He had believed recognition diluted intention. Daniel, meanwhile, placed the letter back inside the violin case, not hidden this time, but preserved with awareness. The melody no longer felt fragile. It felt directive. Both widowed spouses understood the same thing by dawn: the song was not meant to remain a private ritual. It was meant to move. Margaret began drafting plans to expand Ellington Global's philanthropic branch into a national music therapy foundation. Daniel began imagining what it might mean to play the melody somewhere larger than a lobby during a break shift. Neither had spoken yet about partnership. But both sensed that Thomas's final instruction had already begun reshaping their separate grief into shared purpose. Because if the music had survived them, then the next question was not whether it should be played again. It was where. And the answer would require both of them to step beyond memory, into legacy. Some inherit money. Others inherit unfinished promises. The weeks following the discovery of Thomas's letter did not unfold dramatically. There were no explosive announcements, no public spectacle. Instead, there was quiet movement, the kind that reshapes institutions not through noise, but through intention. Margaret Ellington returned to her office with a focus her executive team had not seen in years. It was not the sharp intensity of crisis management, nor the calculated ambition of expansion. It was something steadier. Something rooted. For 3 years after Thomas's death, she had guarded his memory privately, preserving it like fragile glass. His name remained on the foundation wing of Ellington Global, but philanthropy had always been structured, controlled, carefully scaled. Now she revisited the hospital records not as a corporate donor, but as a widow reading between lines. She learned how often Thomas had stayed past visiting hours, how he had brought sheet music instead of flowers, how nurses remembered him not for his wealth but for his listening. He had never told her. Not because he wished to hide it, but because he did not see it as extraordinary. Margaret sat in the oncology wing one afternoon, unannounced, watching a young patient tentatively press piano keys while a volunteer encouraged her. The sound was uneven, uncertain, but alive. She imagined Thomas sitting in that same corridor, offering structure without ownership, helping someone else author beauty while quietly confronting his own decline. Across the city, Daniel Reeves continued working night shifts at Ellington Tower, but something inside him had shifted. The melody no longer felt confined to memory. When he practiced now, it carried forward motion rather than backward ache. Sophie sometimes sat cross-legged on the living room rug while he played, humming a faint harmony she had invented herself. The music did not belong solely to loss anymore. It belonged to continuation. Margaret reached out formally one evening, not through corporate channels, but through handwritten correspondence. She proposed a meeting to discuss expanding Thomas's private volunteer efforts into a national music therapy initiative, one that would carry both Emily's and Thomas's names. Daniel read the letter slowly, absorbing the weight of what it implied. It was not charity. It was stewardship. They met again in the same conference room overlooking the Hudson, but the atmosphere was different now. Less investigative. More collaborative. Margaret spoke not as CEO but as someone ready to transform grief into infrastructure. She envisioned dedicated therapy wings funded permanently rather than sporadically, training programs for musicians, scholarships for families navigating terminal diagnoses. Daniel listened with humility, but also hesitation. He had never imagined his life intersecting with corporate scale. He was a father rebuilding one day at a time. Yet the letter Thomas left behind lingered in his mind, the instruction that the music should belong somewhere larger than one house. Margaret understood the conflict before he voiced it. She did not offer him a role out of obligation. She offered it because continuity required authenticity. The melody could not become a marketing device. It needed someone who carried its origin. Over the next month, Ellington Global quietly announced the formation of the Ellington Reeves Music Therapy Initiative. Press coverage framed it as a philanthropic expansion inspired by personal history. Analysts praised the human dimension. Investors approved the strategic optics. But beneath public interpretation, something more intimate was unfolding. The first official program launched in the same hospital where Emily had once composed her final Valentine melody. Daniel stood near the back during the opening ceremony, not seeking recognition. Margaret delivered a speech about resilience without mentioning valuation metrics. She spoke of unfinished chords, of courage inside hospital rooms, of the belief that creativity can outlast diagnosis. When the ribbon was cut, a small ensemble of musicians performed the Valentine melody publicly for the first time, arranged for strings and piano. It filled the wing with something warmer than antiseptic air. Patients listened. Nurses paused. Even administrators stood quietly, aware that the sound carried more than notes. Daniel felt the ache of memory, but it no longer isolated him. It connected him to a room full of people navigating similar terrain. Margaret, standing only a few feet away, felt the same realization. Thomas's final year had not been defined solely by decline. It had been defined by quiet contribution. Grief had not been erased. It had been redirected. Later that evening, as Margaret stood alone in the hospital corridor, she noticed a plaque newly installed near the therapy rooms. It bore two names side by side, Thomas Ellington and Emily Reeves. Beneath them, a simple inscription. Music survives where we cannot. She traced the letters gently with her fingers, understanding that legacy is rarely what we think it will be. It is not the towers built in our names, nor the valuations recorded in annual reports. It is the continuation of something we began without realizing it would outlive us. Daniel returned home that night to Sophie, who asked whether her mother's song had been played. He nodded, and she smiled with quiet pride. The melody had moved beyond their apartment walls. It had entered hallways where other families waited for news, for hope, for comfort. Neither Daniel nor Margaret knew where the initiative would ultimately lead. But they both understood that Valentine's Day would never again feel like survival alone. It would feel like inheritance. And as the first therapy sessions began filling with hesitant, hopeful notes, the melody that once belonged to two dying composers began doing what Thomas had predicted. It finished what they started. He had prepared for silence. Instead, he left a voice. The expansion of the Ellington Reeves Music Therapy Initiative brought new momentum into Margaret's life, but it also reopened archives she had avoided for years. Thomas had been meticulous about documentation. Not only corporate files and philanthropic records, but private audio journals stored in encrypted folders labeled by date rather than topic. For 3 years, she had not opened them. She had told herself that memory was already heavy enough. But the melody had returned. And with it came a question that would not quiet itself: how much of Thomas's final year had she never fully understood? One evening, alone in her study overlooking the Manhattan skyline, Margaret accessed a file labeled simply, Valentine Project, in case. The recording began with ambient hospital noise faint in the background, distant footsteps, the low hum of machines. Thomas's voice entered calmly, without drama. He did not sound like a man preparing for public legacy. He sounded like a man speaking privately to a future he suspected he would not see. He described meeting a woman who insisted on finishing a melody even after doctors shifted their language from treatment to management. He spoke of her husband sitting quietly beside her, absorbing every note as if committing it to memory. He admitted that working with them felt different from board meetings and investor calls. It felt immediate. Human. Urgent in a way no acquisition ever had. Then his tone shifted, softer. He confessed that he had not shared the collaboration at home because he did not want to turn something fragile into something performative. He believed kindness should remain unadvertised. He acknowledged his own diagnosis, one he had shielded from public knowledge even before the crash. He knew his time might be shorter than expected. He did not want sympathy attached to service. If the melody survives, he said in the recording, let it do more than remind people of us. Let it reach someone who still has time. Margaret sat motionless as the recording ended. There was no grand farewell. No dramatic goodbye. Just the click of a device being turned off. For years, she had framed Thomas's death as an interruption. A violent halt to plans carefully laid. Now she began to see that even within his final months, he had been constructing something quieter than a corporation and more durable than headlines. Across town, Daniel received a call from the oncology center informing him that additional archived materials had surfaced during administrative reorganization. Among them was a digital recording session from the day Emily finalized her composition. Daniel drove there after his shift, unsure what he was ready to hear. Inside a small office at the hospital, a staff member played the audio file. Emily's voice entered first, thin from treatment but unmistakably resolute. She spoke about wanting the melody to feel unfinished on purpose, explaining that she did not want it to sound like an ending. In the background, Thomas offered a suggestion about tempo, not as authority but as collaborator. Daniel listened to the exchange without interruption. He realized that the music he had been playing every Valentine's Day was not simply a memory of Emily. It was evidence of partnership between two people confronting mortality differently but harmonizing nonetheless. When the recording ended, Daniel did not cry. He felt steadier. The melody had not been composed in despair. It had been composed in defiance of despair. Margaret and Daniel met again soon after, not in a conference room this time but inside the newly funded therapy wing. They stood near a window overlooking a courtyard where young patients gathered for group sessions. Neither needed to repeat what they had heard in the recordings. They understood instinctively that Thomas and Emily had left more than notes behind. They had left direction. Margaret announced an expansion of the initiative beyond oncology, extending it to trauma recovery centers and pediatric hospitals nationwide. The decision was not framed as emotional tribute. It was framed as structural commitment. Daniel began training as a certified music therapy coordinator under the foundation's sponsorship. He did not abandon his humility. He carried it forward. The security uniform gradually gave way to program leadership, but his posture remained unchanged, steady, grounded, intentional. The melody evolved too. Arrangements were created for orchestras, youth ensembles, even digital platforms. But its core remained intact, the unfinished cadence at the end, the subtle space left deliberately unresolved. That unresolved space became its signature. One evening, as Margaret walked through the therapy wing after visiting hours, she heard a young boy tentatively practicing the melody on a keyboard. His fingers stumbled. The notes wavered. But the shape was recognizable. The music no longer belonged to two families. It belonged to anyone willing to play it. Margaret paused at the doorway, recognizing that Thomas had prepared not for silence but for continuity. Daniel, in his apartment later that night, watched Sophie attempt to hum harmony once again. The melody was becoming generational in a way neither Thomas nor Emily could have predicted. Grief had not been erased. It had been transformed into infrastructure, into rooms filled with tentative courage, into recordings that refused to disappear. But legacy, once expanded, carries its own weight. And as national media began profiling the foundation's rapid growth, Margaret knew that visibility would bring scrutiny, questions about motive, about timing, about why the initiative had not existed sooner. The world was about to look closely. And when it did, it would test whether this inheritance was rooted in sentiment or conviction. Influence builds towers. Purpose builds permanence. The national expansion of the Ellington Reeves Music Therapy Initiative did not go unnoticed. Within months, major publications began profiling the foundation as a case study in grief-driven philanthropy. Headlines framed it as redemption, as transformation, even as strategic rebranding. Margaret read them all with measured detachment. She understood how narratives were shaped. Markets prefer a storyline. They compress complexity into something easily digestible. But what the headlines could not quantify was the quiet shift inside Ellington Global itself. Board members who once evaluated every initiative by return on investment metrics now found themselves reviewing reports that measured something harder to chart: patient engagement, therapy retention, emotional resilience markers. The foundation's growth was steady, sustainable, but not explosive in the way acquisitions had once been. It required patience rather than dominance. Some investors questioned the long-term scale. Philanthropy should support the brand, not redefine it, one analyst remarked during a quarterly call. Margaret responded without defensiveness. She explained that longevity of a corporation is not sustained solely by expansion but by trust. And trust, she argued, is built when institutions demonstrate they understand human vulnerability, not just capital efficiency. The markets did not revolt. They adjusted. Across the country, therapy rooms funded by the initiative began filling with families who had never heard of Thomas Ellington or Emily Reeves. Children recovering from trauma pressed hesitant keys on donated pianos. Veterans sat with guitars in their laps, rediscovering sound after silence. Oncology patients composed lullabies they hoped would outlive them. Daniel traveled frequently now, overseeing program development in different cities. He moved through hospital corridors with quiet authority, not corporate, not self-conscious, but rooted. He introduced himself not by title, but by story. He explained how a melody written during terminal illness had refused to disappear. The story carried weight precisely because it did not seek admiration. Margaret noticed something else unfolding within her company. Younger executives began volunteering for foundation placements. Internship applications increased for departments tied to community outreach. The culture shifted subtly from aggressive growth toward balanced influence. Power, when anchored in purpose, began attracting a different kind of ambition. Yet with expansion came scrutiny. A prominent financial journal published an editorial questioning whether Ellington Global's philanthropic pivot was masking stagnation in other divisions. The article did not accuse. It implied. It suggested emotional leadership might compromise competitive edge. The board requested reassurance. Margaret reviewed quarterly reports personally before the next earnings call. The numbers remained strong. Not spectacular. Not inflated. Stable. On the call, she did not defend the foundation as emotional necessity. She presented it as strategic foresight. She explained that corporations able to align profit with social continuity build resilience beyond market cycles. Daniel listened to the call replay later that night from a hotel room in Chicago, where he had just concluded a workshop with pediatric nurses learning music-based coping techniques. He recognized in Margaret's voice a balance she had not carried before, not the rigid control of widowhood, but integrated conviction. He remembered the first Valentine's Day he played in the lobby. The music had felt fragile then. Now it felt infrastructural. One afternoon, Margaret visited a newly opened therapy center in Boston. She stood unnoticed in the back while a young girl performed the Valentine melody on a violin slightly too large for her frame. The notes wavered but held. The final unresolved chord lingered in the air exactly as Thomas and Emily had intended, not closed, not finished. Margaret felt no breakdown this time. No collapse of composure. She felt alignment. The melody had traveled from hospital room to corporate lobby to national foundation. It had outgrown both grief and coincidence. Power had not been diminished by purpose. It had been clarified. Yet clarity invites responsibility. As the initiative approached its first anniversary, Margaret proposed hosting a public Valentine's concert in the Ellington Tower lobby, the same place where the melody had unexpectedly reunited two widowed lives. Not as spectacle. As acknowledgement. Daniel hesitated initially. The lobby still carried memory of that first fragile performance. But he understood the symbolism. The music had returned once by accident. Now it would return by design. Invitations were sent quietly. Patients, volunteers, staff, and investors were invited not to observe a performance, but to witness continuity. As preparations began, Margaret stood once more beneath the chandelier in the marble lobby. The space no longer felt transactional. It felt layered. 1 year earlier, she had descended in shock. Now she stood waiting, not for memory to wound her, but for legacy to move forward. Because the final Valentine's performance would not belong solely to Daniel. Or to her. It would belong to everyone the melody had reached. And in that gathering, power would bow fully, not to sentiment, but to something far stronger. Shared inheritance. Some melodies fade when the room empties. This one stayed. On the evening of the anniversary concert, Ellington Tower did not resemble a corporate headquarters. The marble lobby that once echoed with hurried footsteps and transactional exchanges now carried a different kind of anticipation. Rows of chairs replaced standing desks. Soft lighting warmed the glass walls. Families from therapy programs across the country gathered quietly, their presence transforming the space from architectural statement to human sanctuary. Margaret stood near the rear of the lobby before guests arrived, observing the transformation with reflective calm. 1 year earlier, she had descended in shock, undone by a melody she believed belonged solely to her past. Tonight, she stood not as a grieving widow startled by memory, but as a steward of something larger than either loss or recognition. Daniel arrived with Sophie shortly before the doors opened. The violin case rested in his hand with the same reverence it had always carried, but the weight felt different now. It no longer held only private remembrance. It carried collective continuation. As guests filled the space, hospital volunteers, young patients, investors who had once questioned the initiative's scale, the air shifted into attentive stillness. Margaret stepped to the front briefly, not to recount tragedy, but to acknowledge trajectory. She spoke of collaboration that began in a hospital room, of unfinished chords intentionally left open, of how purpose can emerge from proximity to pain. There was no dramatization. Only clarity. When Daniel stepped beneath the chandelier once more, the memory of his first performance flickered through him. That earlier day had been fragile, unplanned, uncertain. This moment felt anchored. He raised the violin. The opening notes emerged steady, warm, deliberate. The melody no longer sounded hesitant. It sounded inhabited. As it moved through the lobby, it did not climb alone. A small ensemble joined softly, piano, cello, a second violin played by a former patient who had completed therapy through the foundation. The sound expanded without overwhelming its origin. Margaret listened without bracing for impact. The descending minor chord arrived as it always had, unresolved, suspended in quiet expectation. But instead of silence following it, something extraordinary happened. Sophie's voice, clear and unafraid, carried a gentle harmony over the lingering note. It was not part of the original composition. It was addition. The audience did not applaud immediately. They allowed the sound to settle fully before responding. Some wept openly. Others simply closed their eyes, recognizing that what they were witnessing was not performance, but proof. Proof that grief can evolve. Proof that love can collaborate beyond death. Proof that unfinished does not mean incomplete. Margaret felt no fracture this time. No collapsing composure. She felt expansion, the kind that does not overwhelm but steadies. Thomas's legacy was no longer confined to a memory she guarded alone. Emily's courage was no longer contained within one family's sorrow. The melody had traveled through time and infrastructure and returned stronger than either of them could have predicted. When the concert concluded, families lingered rather than rushed to exits. Conversations replaced silence. Children touched instruments with tentative curiosity. Investors who once evaluated initiatives through projections now stood beside patients discussing possibility. Daniel closed the violin case slowly, aware that the music would not return to dormancy for another year. It no longer needed an annual ritual to survive. It existed in therapy rooms, rehearsal halls, hospital wings, and in the voice of his daughter who had claimed it as her own. Margaret approached him quietly. There were no formal remarks exchanged, no performative gratitude. They stood side by side, observing the lobby transformed by something neither corporation nor grief alone could have produced. Outside, the Manhattan skyline shimmered against the night, unchanged in structure yet altered in meaning. Power had not been diminished by vulnerability. It had been redirected by it. As the final guests departed and the lights dimmed, the chandelier reflected softly against the polished floor. The lobby returned to stillness, but not emptiness. Because the melody remained. It remained in plaques bearing two names once unfamiliar to each other. It remained in therapy programs expanding beyond city limits. It remained in the quiet confidence of a woman who had learned that control is not the same as strength. It remained in the steady hands of a father who discovered that remembrance can build forward. Valentine's Day would come again. But it would never again feel like survival. It would feel like stewardship. And somewhere, in rooms far from Manhattan, someone would press hesitant fingers against keys or strings, begin the opening phrase of an unfinished song, and understand without being told that they were part of something enduring. Not because tragedy demanded it, but because love had insisted on it.